Good afternoon, everyone. We still have a few more people signing up and getting logged in, so I'll just give you guys a few minutes. All right, everyone. My name is Sarah Brooks. I'm the Communications Manager at the Amyloidosis Research Consortium. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on expanded access. I'd like to cover a few housekeeping topics before we get started. Today's webinar is being recorded. A copy of the webinar will be sent to all attendees and will also be on ARC's website. All attendees are in listen-only mode. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You can type your question into the Q&A box and our speakers will answer it during the Q&A at the end of the webinar. A little bit about ARC. We were established in 2015 with a focus on accelerating drug development of novel treatments for all types of amyloidosis and ensuring that patients have access to those treatments. While many patients have benefited from treatments that were approved for other diseases, we currently have no FDA-approved therapies for any type of amyloidosis. However, the landscape for AL and ATTR amyloidosis is fast changing, with a number of novel treatments in development, some almost within grasp. At ARC, we have received many requests from patients and caregivers looking for information on how they might access these treatments. It can be very challenging to know that what the options potentially are available that may allow you to access a treatment before it has gained FDA approval and is readily available. We are excited to be hosting a webinar about this subject, and it is particularly timely with the news that the U.S. House of Representatives passed the Right to Try bill. We are delighted to announce our two speakers. First is Dr. Jennifer Miller, who is an assistant professor at Yale University School of Medicine. She's also the founder of Bioethics International, a nonprofit dedicated to raising the bar on how we understand and operationalize bioethics and patient centricity in the healthcare and innovation sector. She's also founded the Good Pharma Scorecard, an index that ranks new drugs and pharmaceutical companies on ethics and patient centricity performance criteria. Our second speaker is Dr. Allison Bateman-House, who's an assistant professor at the NYU School of Medicine's Division of Medical Ethics and co-chair of the Working Group on Compassionate Use and Pre-Approval Access. She serves as a chair of Compassionate Use Advisory Committee, Infectious Diseases, and Neuropsychology. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Jennifer and Allison.
So today we are going to give you an abridged webinar due to the technical challenges, but basically we're going to cover some of the ways that you can access an experimental drug, including through clinical trials and expanded access programs, some of the challenges with the current programs, and then very practical how-to advice on how to access experimental therapies. So to begin with, it's very important to note that the United States is a nation that consumes a lot of prescription drugs. In the past 30 days, about half of the US population has taken at least one prescription drug. 11% have taken 5 or more. And if you're age 45 or over, people that age report taking 4 or more prescription daily medicines daily. Almost 70% of physician visits involve drug therapy, 73% of hospital outpatient visits. You get the point. But the question is, what happens if the drug biologic that you need is not yet approved by the FDA or is still in clinical development? Well, if that is the case, then in general, you have 3 ways to access the experimental drug. Some are better than others. The first way is to enroll in a clinical trial. And the second way is to try and exercise some type of medical tourism, either by going to another country or importing the drug from elsewhere. Why is it that the current clinical trial pathway that we have for accessing experimental drugs is insufficient? In general, it is insufficient for 4 reasons. The first is that clinical trials often have very strict inclusion and exclusion criteria. In general, clinical trials tend to be conducted in healthy, young, white males. That means there's not a lot of minority representation by race or ethnicity. There's not a lot of elderly populations, pediatric populations, pregnant women, and things like that. In general, there are clinical trial deserts. Trials tend to be open near large academic medical centers, so there are also geographic limitations. Secondly, enrolling in a clinical trial, as most of you would know, does not guarantee that you will get access to the experimental drug that your physician is recommending or suggesting. You could be enrolled in the control arm, which may be a placebo or another standard of care. Thirdly, there are simply not a lot of clinical trials open at one time for an experimental therapy. In general, for a drug to get approved, there's about 2 to 3 phase 2 or 3 trials open. At most, there are a median of 9 trials going on. So again, geographic limitations. And lastly, a lot of clinical trials are never registered or don't have summary results reported, so it's often hard to find out about clinical trials that are taking place, let alone open and enrolling clinical trials. So let's talk a little bit about the demographic representation in clinical trials. Here you can see some data published on drugs that were approved by the FDA between 2011 and 2013. And what you see is that most of the pivotal trials were conducted in white people, 79%. Only 7% were Black, 7% Asian. And the median age of trial participants was 52 years. So again, not a lot of comorbidities, not a huge age range. Then if you look at specific disease trials, you also see that women tend to be underrepresented. And here on this page, you see an example of heart failure trials. I've just been informed that you cannot see the screen. Let's try this again. Okay. All right, so this was the slide describing the prescription drug use in the United States, showing only about half of the US population has taken at least one prescription drug. We talked about clinical trials being one of the main ways to access experimental drugs, but that they have limitations. First and foremost, one of the limitations is the lack of demographic representation. Here you can see a trial on the left side of the screen conducted by Nick Downing and colleagues, showing that pivotal trials for drugs approved between 2011 and 2013 by the FDA enrolled mostly white people. And then you can see that heart failure trials tend not to enroll a lot of minorities, not a lot of elderly patients, and women are also underrepresented. I've conducted my own study, which should be hopefully published soon, looking at the drugs approved by the FDA in 2014, finding pretty much exactly the same numbers. You find that about 78% of the trials are conducted in whites or Caucasians and very few in other types of race and ethnicities. So it's not just that there are demographic representation challenges with accessing clinical trials. As I mentioned, a lot of clinical trials are not registered and there aren't a lot of summary results posted. So it's hard to know the safety and efficacy information about these experimental therapies. This was a banner study, which you can see right now, conducted by Rob Califf and Monique Anderson when Rob was still at Duke and hadn't joined the FDA yet. And here what you see is that only about 13% of clinical trials had summary results reported in clinicaltrials.gov. That's the NIH repository for sharing clinical trial results, 12 months post the primary completion date of a trial. That's a very low number. And then you can see even if you look at 60 months after the trials are over, you're hovering still around 50% of trials. Again, I've conducted my own study, and what I can tell you is that about half of all of the reviewed drugs, these were drugs approved by the FDA in 2012, had undisclosed phase 2 or 3 trial results 13 months after FDA approval. And here on the screen, you can just see a sampling of drugs by clinical trial transparency measured at 13 months post FDA approval. Some are very transparent and others are rather opaque. So again, hard to know about trials. We are trying to fix this by ranking drugs and companies on their clinical trial transparency to address that factor. And we're also ranking drugs on their demographic inclusivity to address that issue. But in the meantime, what are your other alternatives? One of them is to seek expanded access. This term is, different groups are using the term, different terms: compassionate use, expanded access, pre-approval access, right to try. Under FDA regulations, there's generally 3 ways of thinking about expanded access. There can be a program for individual patients, which would include an emergency use. There can be a program for an intermediate size patient population, or a much larger program that allows for widespread use. Now, how do you qualify for an expanded access program? Well, there are 3 categories of qualifications that you need to think about. The first involve what the FDA will consider. You should have a serious disease or condition or an immediately life-threatening condition. And you can see on the screen how the FDA is sort of thinking about those definitions. So not only must you have a serious disease and condition or immediately life-threatening condition, you must also have no access to comparable or satisfactory alternative therapy, and you cannot have access to a clinical trial, either because there's none open, you don't live near one, you don't qualify for the inclusion-exclusion criteria we already talked about, or the like. Additionally, the FDA has to determine that the risk benefit profile of your participation is appropriate, and that your participation in the expanded access program in general won't interfere with the clinical development and marketing approval of the indication that you're seeking expanded access for. So basically, they're not going to impede market access to the drug. What the FDA doesn't say on its website is that, in general, the experimental agent should also have finished phase 1 trials. So you can see a little image at the right-hand bottom of the screen that shows you that expanded access programs tend to occur during phase 2 and 3 in the drug development space, so after phase 1s have been completed. So what is important to note, while the FDA does consider the benefit risk profile and all of these other conditions to determine whether they're going to grant expanded access, 99.7% of the requests are granted. So in general, the FDA isn't a barrier to gaining access to experimental drugs through expanded access programs. So in addition to the qualifications I already mentioned, you also need to find a physician who's willing to do 4 things: oversee your treatment, work with the company who manufactures the drug and the FDA, and obtain the drug or the biologic, monitor you during the full course of the treatment, and file all of the necessary paperwork. I will note that even if the FDA approves your request and you find a willing physician to work with you, ultimately the company has to agree to provide the experimental therapy. Without the company's cooperation, you generally are not able to access the experimental product. There's a specific process you need to follow in order to request expanded access program, which my colleague Allison Bateman-House is going to go over with you. So I'm going to skip this slide for now. I want to tell you a little bit about the characteristics of expanded access programs that have already taken place. In a study published last year, I, along with my colleagues, Art Kaplan, Joe Ross, and Ken Mock, reviewed all of the registered expanded access programs to create a typology of characteristics. And what I can tell you is that for the registered programs, most of them are sponsored by the industry, 61%. In contrast, only about 4% are sponsored by a US government entity. Most of the programs are providing access to drugs, 71%. The top conditions treated, that's not quite the right word, provided access to therapies are for HIV, leukemia, multiple myeloma, and you can read the other ones on the screen. In general, expanded access programs are tending to provide access to experimental therapies to adults and some seniors, not as many children. And here you can see about 54% of the programs enroll adults and seniors. Only about 6% are geared specifically towards children. And you can see the further breakdown on the screen. Something else to note is that 2% of the registered expanded access programs have reported results for the program. So in the same way that a clinical trial would report results in clinicaltrials.gov, 2% of the expanded access programs were able to do this too. So expanded access programs may be a source of real world data. And in fact, the FDA has used expanded access data to approve a few drugs. Here's an example of 2 approvals that were impacted by expanded access data. I expect this to increase over time. And while only, I also want to note that this data that I'm showing you is biased in the sense that it's only covering registered expanded access programs. There is a new rule that went into effect recently called the final rule. Under the final rule, every expanded access program is now required to be registered in clinicaltrials.gov. But prior to the enactment of the final rule, there was no such requirement. So this sample of 398 programs is an opt-in system, so it can be biased. Notwithstanding, what we found is that almost 70% of the registered expanded access programs provided access to drugs that were ultimately approved by the FDA. So 70% of the programs provided drugs that were ultimately approved by the FDA. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Allison, who's going to go through the practicalities of how to apply for expanded access and a bit more about the history and right to try.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for bearing with us during these technical difficulties. Believe it or not, we did have a mock run just the other day to make sure things like this didn't happen, and I guess best intentions go astray. So hopefully you can see that, and hopefully Sarah will let Jennifer know if you can't actually see it. So I'm Allison Bateman-House again. I'm at New York University Medical Center, and I have a disclosure slide here to show that I work with numerous pharmaceutical companies and patient advocacy groups, just so that you are aware of those ties. And I especially wanted to show this because I understand a drug that's coming out or is in clinical trials right now for your disease is being produced by Janssen Pharmaceutical, which I have a long-standing relationship with. So I don't know anything particularly about that development program, but I just want to be transparent that I do have ties with Janssen. Okay, so as Jennifer said, obviously the best way to get access to an investigational drug or any sort of investigational medical product is through a clinical trial, simply because it it benefits everyone. It provides societal benefit. It provides generalizable data to help future patients. Even if you end up not getting a useful active drug, you still get increased surveillance from your medical care team. So, if you're running a fever or having some sort of, concerning lab work, they're more likely to find it than might otherwise be the case. Hopefully, at the end of the study, if there was an active treatment that was helpful and you want to continue receiving it after you participated in the study, you will be able to get it through post-trial access. I say hopefully because unfortunately not all programs do that, and that's one of the things that we are pushing for is more post-trial access as a courtesy to those who, gave of themselves during the trial. And last but not least, of course, trial data is considered more robust data, and insurers are always looking for robust data when trying to decide whether they're going to reimburse for the cost of a new drug or not. So there are numerous reasons to go through a clinical trial. And as Jennifer said, unfortunately, just not everybody can get into clinical trials, so I won't belabor that. And as Jennifer said, there are things you can do if you can't enter a clinical trial. So as she said, there's medical tourism where you go abroad to another country. There's the flip side of that, which is personal importation from another country. So say the drug is available in pharmacies in Japan or Canada or whatnot, and you actually order it and have it shipped to you in the United States. There's self-experimentation. The classic example I give of this is ALS patients who try to use supplements or other approved products, not for ALS, but for other conditions to try to improve their own medical condition. But of course, what we're talking about mainly here is what is alternately called pre-approval access, compassionate use, special access, and all the other terms that Jennifer went through. And, just again, to remind you, it's access to a medical product before it's approved by the regulator and outside of a clinical trial. I have the regulatory definitions here, but you've already seen them with Jennifer. And so the point is that it's non-trial access for therapeutic purposes for that individual person, rather than to try to get generalizable data. And as Jennifer said, of course, sometimes you could be trying to seek it in an emergency context. Sometimes it may not be an emergency. Sometimes it's just for a one-off patient. Sometimes it's for this intermediate group, which the FDA helpfully defines as at least 2 and less than many. Or you can get it through the large group program, which is for many patients. And normally that is when a drug is going through clinical trials. The phase 3 trial is completed, but we know that there'll be a period of time before the drug is reviewed by the FDA for possible approval. And even if it does get approved, we know there'll be a lag before the drug appears in the pharmacy. So that's normally when these large treatment group programs happen. And, many people are sort of aware of compassionate use or expanded access almost as a historical issue, thinking back to the AIDS epidemic and ACT UP and other activists who said, we are dying of a disease and there's not enough time or not enough trials for all of us. So please just let us have a chance to try investigational drugs, knowing they may not work, knowing they may actually harm us, but let us try. And all of that is true. Now, expanded access actually predated HIV. You can see here that it existed since the late 1970s, and it certainly has continued to grow since the HIV period. So even though this is what many people have in the back of their mind when they hear the terms compassionate use, that's only one small snapshot of the whole experience. And it's important to realize that there have been many changes between that time period and today. So Jennifer said I would walk you through the actual process, and she already noted most of this, but I'm going to actually give you the recipe in terms of, the order of operations. So as she said, first you have to identify a physician. In some therapeutic areas like oncology, I think it's more easy to find a physician who's willing to go down this path with you. In neurology, particularly ALS, it may be difficult to find a physician. And the only real solution for that is if your physician is not willing to walk down this path with you, you have to find another physician who is. Once you have a physician who's willing to walk down this path with you, the two of you need to agree upon a promising drug that you wish to pursue access to. You can't just, dial someone a 1-800 number and say, I want expanded access, and have someone say, okay, we will try drug X on you. It's actually up to you to identify what drug you think it is that would be promising. And it's up to that partnering physician to actually contact the company to file that request. And Jen was talking about some recent regulation, and there's another piece of recent regulation that comes into play here. It's something called the 21st Century Cures Act, which many of you may be familiar with. And that was a huge bill, but one of the line items in it was a proviso that said once a company has a drug moving into phase 2 of development, they need to have their expanded access policy publicly available. And that has been interpreted mainly to mean on your website. So at this point, when the doctor is trying to figure out how to contact the drug company to request the drug, at this point in time, the doctor should just be able to look up that drug, the manufacturing company's website, and find their access policy on the webpage, along with instructions about what phone number to call, what email to contact, etc. So the physician does contact the company, gives some information about the patient and why he or she thinks that expanded access to this particular drug is a good idea for the patient. And the company, as Jen said, is the gatekeeper here. It gets to say yes or no. So just like any private company would be able to decide who gets its products, the company may say no. And if so, there is no court of appeals you can go to. You can't go to the FDA and have the FDA force the company to give you access. You can't sue in a court of law and get access that way. The only thing that I'm aware of that you can do at this point is turn to the sort of public pressure. And this is where social media campaigns, like some of the ones that have been over the last few years, come in, trying to publicly name and shame a company into giving access to a drug. That's what happens if the drug company says no. If the drug company says yes, at that point, the patient's physician works with a contact from the drug company to fill out a single patient expanded access request form to go to the FDA. This form takes about 45 minutes to complete. It's 8 questions, fairly simple questions about the patient's medical condition, the treatment plan, etc. If it's considered too much of an emergency for that form even to be utilized, the patient's physician and the drug company can do this with the FDA over the phone. And in cases of absolute emergency, the FDA gives a response same day. In cases that are non-emergency, the median response time is 4 days from the FDA. And so generally what happens, well, almost always the FDA says, yes, Jen showed you the slide that said over 99% of requests that go through the FDA are approved. Data shows that approximately 11% of those requests that are approved actually have changes made by the FDA. And these are normally things like the dosage of the drug to be used, the frequency with which that dosage is given, or extra sort of safety precautions tacked on to the treatment plan. So it's not a rubber stamp. The FDA does actually look over the treatment plan in consultation with its therapeutic subject area experts to try to make sure it's going to give the patient the best possible chance of benefiting from the therapeutic experiment with this investigational drug. Last but not least, in order to use an experimental drug at any point, anytime, clinical trial or expanded access, a doctor has to have permission from their institutional review board, which is a body at a hospital or an academic medical center that looks over the protocol to make sure that there's going to be informed consent obtained from the patient and other things. So those are the steps that you have to go through. I know it sounds daunting and onerous, and in some cases it is daunting and onerous, but when it's truly an emergency, this can actually all be done in one day, believe it or not. So, there's a range of experiences between those who have it done super fast and those who don't have it done at all or encounter obstacles along the way. And we're trying to figure out exactly what the difference is that leads people to have one experience versus the other. And my best guess at this point of time is just the familiarity of the parties with this process. Meaning if it's a doctor that has done this before, he or she is going to be much faster than someone who's figuring out for the first time. Same with the drug company, same with the IRB. So if you have a drug that is getting lots of expanded access requests, a company has come up with a process and it's a doctor who has done this before, it should go fairly quickly and smoothly. If it's a one-off request for something that has never been requested before from a company that's never had a request, you're more likely to have problems along the way. Right to try, as was mentioned in the intro, just was passed by Congress 2 days ago. So all that does is it cuts out the FDA part of this process. Everything else still stands. And actually, I see a typo on this. There should be 40 state right to try laws, not 39 at this point, although that's really not of interest or use because it's not the state that controls access to investigational drugs. It is the national government, which is why this national vote is such a big deal. So you still have to identify the physician, you still have to identify the drug, you still have to identify and ask the company. The company still needs to say yes, and the physician still needs to get IRB approval at the institution where the drug will be used. You can see I have some question marks there because that was in debate up until the last second of the vote, but that is in the final language. And what I didn't mention earlier is that in return for getting that investigational drug, the doctor makes a promise to the drug company to report adverse events. And that's so the next time the company has one of these requests, they at least have the experience from the prior attempt to know if the drug caused serious problems in the patient or not. So under right to try, the doctor still will have to report serious adverse events back to the drug company, but not to the FDA, which of course is a problem insofar as the FDA trying to fulfill its public health and consumer protection role for the larger population, but is not a huge concern for the individual person seeking compassionate use at that particular moment. Blah, blah, blah. I have here, we are only aware so far of 2 doctors, both in Texas, using the right to try pathway so far. I'd be happy to answer questions about that during the Q&A. If there's any way we'll be able to see the questions on the Q&A. And I personally have no knowledge of any company willing to provide its products via right to try pathway. So I think for the time being, I would feel comfortable saying for at least the next 6 months, probably a year, companies are going to continue treating requests for access the exact same way that they did prior to this law passing, which is holding it to the standards of the FDA's expanded access program. And I think I'll pause there and see if there are questions.
So there is one question so far, and I'll just pull up the slide. Which the question corresponds. So the question that we received is what do these numbers mean? The industry sponsors about 61% of registered expanded access programs, and the NIH and US federal government sponsored about 4%, who sponsored the other 30-something% of expanded access programs. And according to the database where we got this information, which is clinicaltrials.gov, either the 35% was either didn't have data available about the sponsor, or it was simply labeled as other. And so other doesn't give us any information.
But this is Allison. I can jump in and say that expanded access programs have and can be run by patient advocacy groups, and they can and have been run by individual physicians. So some of that other would be both of those.
That's true, investigator initiated. If you are interested in finding out more specifics about that 30-something%, you can log into clinicaltrials.gov, type in the keywords expanded access, and then download the results. You'll get about 398 programs, and then just sort by other, and then you'll be able to read what other means if you look under funder information.
And this is Allison again. If I can just jump in for 1 second to say, the data that Jennifer is showing is basically so new, not too many people have seen data like this before. When I talk to groups normally about expanded access, my normal line is that it's a fact-free zone. We have no idea how many requests for drugs are made to drug companies. We have no idea how often drug companies say yes, how often they say no. And once the drug is given out to a patient, we have no idea how often it helps the patient, hurts the patient, or does nothing to the patient. So what Jennifer and her team are trying to do, which is incredibly important, is to fill in that fact-free zone with facts. So, you know, this is, as she said, biased data at this point in time because historically there was no requirement to report data. So just certain groups chose to and many groups chose not to. So when you see here that the large number of drugs that were provided via expanded access went on to be approved, I don't think you should take from that that most of the drugs provided in expanded access worked. We don't know that. This is just a sample of what has happened in the past. But going forward, now that we have these reporting requirements, we should have a much better idea. So, and then we had a question that came in asking about charging for drugs during expanded access.
And who pays?
So by law, and again, this could all change now with the new right to try bill that was just passed. So give it 6 months to a year to see if there's new information coming out of the FDA. But up until this point, the FDA has permitted a drug company or manufacturer to charge for its drug in expanded access, but not to profit. So basically to charge just the amount of money it took to actually produce the drug and then transport it to the place where it was to be used. That ruling, that regulation, as far as I'm concerned, will stay the same for drugs obtained through the right to try pathway. I mean, it's for the expanded access pathway. What happens for drugs obtained through the right to try pathway? I have no idea. It is my understanding that companies will be able to charge a profit for those drugs. But again, this is brand new. Nobody's really worked it out yet. Yeah. So generally speaking, companies could charge only a capped amount. And to be perfectly honest, 9 times out of 10, 99% of the time, the companies gave the drugs out for free rather than to charge that capitated amount.
That's right. And it's hard to cap the price that can be charged, given that there's not a lot of transparency around manufacturing costs and research and development costs in general. There's controversy about how to calculate that. The second question, or the third question, is what does accelerated review mean, and has Trump messed that up?
I don't know if Jennifer is able to answer that. Accelerated review, there are probably 8, 9, 10 different accelerated review type programs. They're all slightly different, and I'm not going to go into all of them. But basically, for some reason, either because early data on the drug looks good or because it's a drug for a disease that doesn't have any therapeutic options at the moment, or any other number of reasons, a drug could be moved into this expanded review category. And it simply means that the timetable in which the company and the FDA would be interacting with each other to bring the drug to a final decision it is truncated. Sometimes the drug might even be approved without a phase 3, but the phase 3 is required after the drug is approved. So each of the programs is different, and it's hard to say whether Trump has messed that up or not.
Yeah, in general, accelerated reviews are for drugs for serious conditions that are for an unmet medical need, that fill an unmet medical need. And what accelerated approval allows you to do is approve a drug based on a surrogate endpoint. There are other types of methods for fast tracking the regulatory process. You can go through fast track, breakthrough therapy, accelerated approval, and priority review. There are some great papers out by Aaron Kesselheim and Joe Ross sort of characterizing these programs. If you're interested, just Google them. The next question is about, will Pfizer provide expanded access to, and it mentions a specific drug.
So if you haven't already, I would recommend you go on the Pfizer website. Somewhere on the Pfizer website, they have their expanded access policy. And I don't know if they will mention drug by drug or if they will mention by disease category, or whether they just have a generic one-size-fits-all response, because I'm not on that page right now and I'm afraid to try to get there and mess up our screen share with you again. But that is the latest source of information for Pfizer, is the information actually on its webpage, and there should be either a phone number or an email address or both there that you can follow up to ask specifics.
That's right. And so under the new regulations, companies are now required to post their expanded access policies. And that can mean that the company simply posts that they don't have a program, but generally you should be able to get a lot more information now about companies' programs on their website.
And also, clinicaltrials.gov just recently went through a revamping, and one of the things that happened during the revamping is that if you do a search for that particular drug and pull up the various trials utilizing it, down in the text of that trial descriptor, there's now a line that specifically asks, is it available via expanded access or not? And that's another place you can look.
So we got a question about monitoring and enforcement of regulations. The question is, what happens if companies don't fulfill reporting requirements?
It's too early to answer that because, as I'm saying, it's going to take 6 months to a year for the lawyers to even figure out what the reporting requirements are. I realize there was some language in the bill, but you know, that vague language of legislation needs to get turned into actual to-do items. I think it's too early to say yet. I think Allison's spot on that there will be a learning curve, and that company reporting will probably improve over time as the regulations get clarified. What I can tell you is that if you look at reporting requirements around clinical trial results, there were laws passed in 1997 and 2007, and they were recently updated. Those laws are, the FDAA was passed in 2007, and the final rule clarified FDAA recently. And what you did see is 10 years where the FDA didn't really monitor or enforce clinical trial results reporting requirements, mostly because it turned out that FDAA had a lot of ambiguities, and it wasn't as clear-cut as we had hoped. So hopefully this does not go the way of clinical trial results reporting, monitoring, and enforcement. And this is Allison again. I'll just say, you may recall me saying in expanded access, in return for access to the investigational drug, the physician promised to report serious adverse events to both the drug company and the FDA. And we don't have any good data, sadly, but the strong suspicion on the part of almost all stakeholders is that physicians have been very remiss in reporting those serious adverse events to the FDA. And in fact, if I had had a magic wand and was able to pass whatever legislation I wanted to pass, I would have given FDA the power, the authority, and the extra money for the requisite staffing to actually audit physicians, you know, here and there, just to make sure that that data is coming back in, because I think that data is so important for future patients. Mm-hmm. So I think that about wraps up our time. I'd really like to thank Sarah for putting together this webinar, and for all you guys for participating and for bearing with us with the technical challenges. This isn't the end of the conversation. Please feel free to email Allison or me. And Allison's email is allison.batemanhouse@nyumc.org, and my email is jennifer.e.miller@yale.edu. And we're both also on Twitter.
Yes, so thank you very much.
Thank you.